Hi, everyone. Welcome to ByteSized Live. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host, joined by my friend and colleague Lindsay today. And we are talking about human as usual, which is Lindsay's company. And she'll kind of tell us a little bit about that. But before we kind of jump into that, today's conversation is super important because we see the amount of technology projects fail, especially with our new data that's come up with AI products specifically failing. And those are really built around just the need for that understanding of your culture and your adoption. So this will be a really important conversation to kind of unpack that. But if you haven't been with us before, welcome. I'm always excited to have our returning audience and our new audience members. ByteSized Live is a conversation I do with industry leaders each week that's live on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok. So you can follow us on all of those different platforms to see kind of who we have coming up next. But September is full of exciting guests, and I'm excited for you guys to join that. So the neat part about this format is we can see your comments or your questions wherever you're joining us from. So they all aggregate on the platform and we're able to address them in this live format. If you are watching after the live, feel free to still contribute to that. And we go back in and answer comments. So I encourage you to participate. I encourage you to ask questions while we have Lindsay's valuable time today. So just to kind of test that feature, if you could let us know where in the world you're joining us from today. We do have a very cool global audience, and I always love to see where people are tuning in from on a Tuesday morning here in the States. But all kinds of different time zones throughout the world. So with that, welcome so much, Lindsay. It's so nice to have you on. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and human as usual?
Totally. I'm excited to be in your live event, Kyler. I admire you as you know and your work, and I'm a huge follower. And I know the conversation we're gonna have today, like you said, is going to probably reconcile the
Mhm.
technology part with the organizational part. And from a human as usual perspective, where I come in is right at that transition point when
Mhm.
companies are not too young anymore and they want to kind of build themselves to true scale. My background is in organizational transformation. I spent 20 years in and out of big companies, smaller companies, really, in the middle of disruption. A lot of it had to do with technology disruption, but I also had other involvements in like strategic partnerships in between big companies or helping organizations really change their workplaces and their policies and the way they work. And I transferred all of that experience into human as usual to now treat the event of scaling as a transformational disruption as opposed to only talking about it from a sales and marketing point of view. So
Mhm.
I built my B2B startup around that, and I focus on the human systems behind scaling. And the philosophy behind it is that we can take advantage of the best of what it means to be human in high growth environments.
Yeah, I love that. And I know, I also, admire a lot of your work. And I specifically think that your experience in some of those bigger companies really helps with understanding that journey to maturity. Whether you are a startup or you're, over 500 million and you're trying to figure out like, how do I scale fast? There's still lots of growing points there, and we've seen a lot of that, specifically within businesses needing that new technology. But without your human systems mature, your technology systems are certainly not going to be producing overall value in that. So can you tell us a little bit about understanding the live today is talked about why 70% of companies can't hold on right to what they build. So can you talk about kind of setting the stage for scaling in a maturity? I know you have the maturity chasm and all of those different pieces, but what is the biggest issues you're seeing there?
Yeah, the way I define it is there is an inflection point that all organizations go through every time they're crossing a transition point to grow bigger. That's what I call the scaling maturity chasm. That's the simplest way I could explain such a big problem in just a few words. But it's really where I have found after going through many big transformations end to end that lasted 3 years, or maybe coming into an organization just to turn around in 6 months what should have been done in 5 years. What I
Mm-hmm.
found is that the organizations never really prepare for maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And that chasm, that gap, that lack of discipline or discipline building muscle
Mm-hmm.
is what got them into downhill the majority of the time. So the biggest problem that I think is solvable and is uh, evitable is that being able to identify where in the scaling trajectory of an organization, which can actually be executed on deliberately, that custom is built so that you can intervene and put guardrails around it and be able to execute on it, to manage that transition a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
structurally. So I bring the perspective into specifically the transition of early stage startups, and when they maybe pass the first round of
Yeah.
funding and
Mm-hmm.
become Series A companies,
Mm-hmm.
and get them to understand how to write that trajectory and how to prepare for what to anticipate when they become an enterprise.
And how important would you say is that preparation stage in this overall conversation? Because I don't know about you, but in my day to day experience, I see a lot of people trying to catch up to understanding what that growth looks like
Yeah.
without setting that infrastructure of discipline that you're talking about.
Well, the thing is that there is room for flexibility, right? There is room always for managing the unknown as we see it, kind of interjecting the organization, the strategy, the goals that we set out for the company. But there are also patterns that you can anticipate to
Mm-hmm.
prepare for, right? No, the companies that and I'm sure you see this, having done different iterations at different
Mm-hmm.
companies, there's a point in time where you start to see similar behaviors and similar milestones that get skipped over,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what causes the organization to derail. So what
Mm-hmm.
I found is that, especially founders that maybe are not tier 2 or have not gone through the transition several times, they haven't built sufficiently the foresight to see how an early stage performance will not suffice for becoming a more complex infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to figure out things as we go once you are building an important level of complexity, whether it is more people or a new technology or more consequential decision making in the organization, is not the same as handling the smaller parts of a smaller company. Is handling the sum of all the parts together that brings that challenge, really, for
Mm-hmm.
leaders and founders, that I feel giving them the look around the corner as to what are those common patterns can give them ahead of the game.
I love that idea of kind of look around the corner. And I think that that is a fundamental challenge, especially for founders. I always say a founder and a CEO are two very different things. Many times, and I include myself in this conversation, founders can be very, bold thinkers, very innovative, but they struggle with things like, basic organizational design and understanding. And they either need a strong counterpart that's going to be like, okay, Kyler, like relax and calm down. We're going to need to do that after we build all of these different things to make sure that we can sustain that type of growth. So there's always, at least in my experience, a lot of confusion around what is a founder and what is a CEO. And I think the nice part about your methodology is it lets you go through that journey without any sort of like shame or vulnerability. Just because you are a founder and you're not a CEO material, I'm not the CEO of The Confluential because I'm not CEO material. That's not where my skill set lies. So it would be, a disadvantage to my team if I put myself in that position. Not because I'm not brilliant, amazing, all of those different things. I just have a different level of skill set. And I think that your methodology, what I really like about that is you're able to see where those cracks may lie before you're in the CEO position, totally overwhelmed and not able to sustain that growth.
I agree with you. One of the things that to not fault, of the founders directly either, because to be fair, right, they're coming from an environment that has worked, right, that has built
Absolutely.
traction, that created momentum, that obviously earned the confidence of investors and whatnot, and the public in general and the customers. But it's kind of like the way I look at it is the more you advance in life, you have to learn new things to navigate more complicated parts of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
You cannot be a 40-year-old, mother of three and still behave like a 15-year-old, high school, student.
I
There's
know some of those people though, so.
ideally, ideally, when it comes to scaling an organization, right, you mature your level of understanding as well. And
Mhm,
what worked at the beginning, like the typical phrases, what got you here is not gonna get you there. And I think the intelligent thing to do
mhm.
is to readjust and open your
Absolutely.
perspective to like, okay, what am I facing now? To the extent that I can understand and that I can put the dots together so that I'm better prepared to manage the unknown when it hits in, as opposed to walking into a situation that you have no, you know, foresight for, and then manage the lack of foresight alongside the complexities and the unknowns anyway. So I think it's like scalability insurance to think about it proactively and being able to identify, the main components of what it is going to look like in the future,
Mhm,
as opposed to bringing the mentality of I'm going to continue to break things because we see the pattern and we see the results. And just like in technology, 70% of the technology projects, right, don't make it to the end. It's
mhm,
a it's a it's a symbolic statistics, but it also
mhm,
applies to these kinds of companies. We don't
mhm,
see a lot of success or a high success rates in companies after 5 years or 10 years
mhm,
because they couldn't hold it because they didn't
mhm.
have the capabilities to do that.
Absolutely. And most definitely, I think the more complexity, the more experience a lot of times that you need from the C-suite to navigate those types of things, or, bringing in someone like yourself to kind of say, okay, let's look at what the writing on the wall says here. Let's make sure we're building something sustainable. I think this leads well into one of our audience questions here. And thank you to the audience. Looks like we have some Western Slope people, which I'm in the Western Slope of Colorado, and usually it's a very rural area. We don't get a ton of people from this area, so it's good to know that we've got some rural Colorado joining us today, so thank you. But this question is, what does the discipline look like? What does the discipline muscle look like day to day? How can leaders start building that early?
The discipline muscle is really execution, and we hear this a lot, right? What comes down to is, can I execute on a day-to-day basis without running the company into the ground? Now, what does that mean? It means that an organization has a particular set of, let's say, buckets that we have to check in so that all of them kind of
Mhm,
work together as seamlessly as possible. There's obviously room for mistakes and disasters and things that happen, but intentionally being able to think about the organization, at least the way I propose it to my clients and to the people I work with, is at least to find the buckets in which human touch has something to do with the performance of the company. Is a great place to start to think about it, the day-to-day
mhm,
functioning of an organization. You don't do anything bringing in a technology if the people don't use it or don't know
mhm,
how to execute on it. You don't do anything bringing in clients if the entire client philosophy or the entire product philosophy is not into place, and all of that has to do with the people.
mhm,
So I put this into five specific areas, at least
mhm,
from the perspective of human as usual. There is a component of leadership and management gaps, which is foundational, right? If we have leaders that um, obviously can disagree and can have, dynamics within the organization as leaders, as a team, there's got to be a level of alignment in ways to stick together through the adversity of the company that transpires, right? For
Mhm.
how the people adopt that as well as a
Mhm.
philosophy,
Mhm.
day to day. There is the pace of the scaling that is, for me, extremely important, because we talk a lot about acceleration as a
Mhm.
routine, and there's a point in time where acceleration is no longer beneficial for the
Mhm.
company. There's a point in time when
Yes.
slowing down is going faster, actually.
Mhm.
So being able to make those determinations before it's too late, before the company already leaked a lot of capital or a lot of clients,
Mhm.
is a smart move, both for leaders and for the teams identifying these problems on a day-to-day basis, and building those capabilities to transfer that knowledge and be able to intervene just in time if it's necessary.
Mhm.
The other area that I look into is integration complexities, because this is gonna be right in your alley, Kyler, but there is a lot of change happening in an organization that is disrupting to grow. It's not just the disruption of growth that is
Mhm.
already big and consequential, but it is all the artifacts that are put into place for that company to achieve that growth, which also
Mhm.
causes secondary disruptions to add into the mix. And so being able to insulate. I call my approach an insulator. There are accelerators, there are incubators. I call mine an insulator, because you have to put some boundaries around the timing, the execution approach, the
Mhm.
prioritization that goes into really moving an organization that was small first and now needs to increase, right,
Mhm.
the level of infrastructure. And that also requires a discipline muscle to be able to understand, right?
Mhm.
How do we operate on a day-to-day basis while we are also executing at a slower pace to become
Mhm.
something more.
Mhm.
And then, lastly, I would say the last two pieces for me, I will put them together as, who are we going to be as people? Who are we going to become as people within the company, right? The skill set, the values, the ethos, like how is that identity going to evolve at the same time the whole company is transforming
Mhm.
to achieve a bigger goal and a bigger aspiration.
Absolutely. And I mean, what an amazing answer. I'm curious, when it comes to discipline and measurement of those types of transformational changes, how do you leverage KPIs when we're talking about a lot of more soft skills?
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that challenge there?
Yes, and I'm gonna talk about it again from a human as usual
Yeah.
perspective. I've been trying not only to propose a methodology or a way to execute things that
Hmm.
are like 1,000 times, available out there. I'm also trying to think about it from, like, what is a new standard,
Hmm.
right? And so when I think about metrics or measurable outcomes, I came up with this idea that I call ROI square, where not only are you measuring investment and return on investment,
Hmm.
obviously, right, the making sure that you keep your acquisition costs low so that your retention stays high and you can hopefully, right, keep that under control so everybody wins, which typically goes the opposite direction. The costs rise and people leave, but right, those are metrics that are important. But there's also the piece around the integrity in which we get to those goals.
Hmm.
I come from a ton of circumstances and situations where the means to an end was not necessarily the healthiest means to an
Hmm.
end,
Hmm.
right? And creating an environment that is not conducive of people being able to show up every day and manage the pressure. There have been instances, and there's a lot of stories out there of toxicity and bullying inside the organization. These behaviors that really are
Hmm.
unproductive, that you could have the most amazing product, you can have the most amazing PR, your branding must be loved by everybody, but eventually an environment that is heavy with unproductive behaviors is going to also run itself to the
Mhm.
ground. And so I combine those two elements as the simplest way to measure, right, is the company having all the components to not only drive financial means but also act with integrity in the execution, the way in which people
Mhm.
show up, and the better questions that we can actually ask to manage that human value change that goes from the founder and the teams back and forth, so that everybody's really, building the organization's DNA in the way that transpires operationally.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, I would assume, and you would know better than me, that's really unique to each organization. And part of that kind of fundamental discipline setting stage is understanding, like, what are we measuring and how are we understanding that? How are we holding each other accountable in that different piece? So I
Yeah.
love that answer. So let's talk a little bit about, before we go back to these amazing questions we have from the audience, which is always something we will go back to. Let's take a little bit of a step back. I like how we were kind of going into what are kind of the slowing down, speeding up. Let's talk a little bit about what can happen when companies can't hold on to what they built. And it's not any sort of like, fear mongering. It's just an understanding of like, what are the consequences of us not getting discipline, setting this infrastructure, being able to operate as a mature team, scale with our customers. What happens if we don't do that?
I mean, let's say that the tragic answer is, right, ultimately the company disappears, right,
Mhm.
and it cannot remain functional, so they end up either selling it or bankrupting it or plainly closing it out. But before that happens, which is hopefully what we don't see happen, the biggest problem is that the company gets stuck in what I call regression loops,
Mhm.
right? Spending a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of energy in starting and restarting and ending and restarting and going back and forth, stuck in a single issue that becomes a systemic point of failure, basically. Relating it back to what brings us, in common here, you and I, Kyler, a traditional example is these technology projects that
Mhm.
have a 1 year roadmap and end up being delivered in four,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yep.
not because of the technology
Mhm. Oh yeah.
itself, but because the internal dynamics of the organization caused everybody, right, to
Mhm.
be in disarray and disoriented, and the strategic goals of the company do not align
Mhm.
with the strategic goals of, the implementation itself. So to me, that is the biggest waste of time.
Mhm.
And I think that we see it just too often. And
Yes.
if we could have, when I say slowing down, people get scared because I get
Oh
that
yeah.
too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
like, oh my God, how are we going to slow down? And we don't
We
have time and we
can't.
have to
Yeah.
report
Mhm.
traction and whatnot. The problem is that you could report on illusion numbers, or you could be strategic about it and say, you know what, we're going to time box the next 6 months to get this part right, and then we're going to execute on it in three, once you have the clarity, the alignment, and all
Mhm.
the pieces in place to just push it out the door, which is what I did coming in organizations that needed a turnaround anyway.
Mhm.
So if you could do that as a strategic advantage, right, and present it as a way to accelerate better,
Mhm.
right, because you will be removing roadblocks in a faster way as opposed to dealing with the natural roadblocks of these kinds of disruptions by surprise. um you would be really dealing with those regression loops, or actually, right, avoiding getting stuck in regression loops,
Mhm.
more than typical companies do all the time.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think it's, goes back to the maturity and insight of the leadership team to be able to say, "Oh, we are in a regression loop." Because so many times we don't have the awareness in our team to be like, "Hey, we're looping here. We are, we're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We talk about the same thing every quarter. about what we're going to do about it, and then we meet the same problem every quarter, and that's a total, as you said, waste of time. It's a very inefficient way to spend your
Yeah.
time. So in you kind of named the regression loop, but what are some other kind of like common patterns or red flags that you see for specifically that challenge scaling?
Yeah. And I'm gonna say this from a really diverse perspective, because I've been in technology, I've been in retail, I've been in biotech, I've been in
Mhm,
Fortune 500 companies, as well as growth brands that have 500 people
mhm,
in them. And the pattern is typically the same across the board. You start to see strategy fatigue, for example, just a
mhm,
lot of strategy, not being able to translate that strategy into execution, keeping it in PowerPoints over PowerPoints over PowerPoints. You can see uh, missed targets is a typical one, right?
mhm,
Not being able to know what we're delivering on, and so you have an epidemic of missed targets that become a big, gigantic bubble of failure within the company. Because we need to remember companies are interconnected pieces, right? It's not
mhm.
like I can miss something here and it's not going to have a downstream effect.
Yes.
And right, so instead of compounding momentum and spearheading innovation in the areas where execution can be a differentiating factor,
Mhm,
we see the team, right, losing energy, the alignment being misplaced. Obviously, companies may become successful at acquiring more and more and more customers,
mhm,
but that doesn't translate in the actual service of those customers, right, to
mhm,
keep them loyal. We could also see companies applying playbooks that are completely misaligned with the current challenges, just trying to put band-aids on things, which always explodes. Like it may
yeah,
put a band-aid quickly, but at the end of the day, right, it's just going to outgrow the actual challenges.
mhm,
um well, I mean, if we think about the human value change I was mentioning, which I always see it as an ecosystem, right? The investor, the founder, the teams. We also see the tension between founders and investors,
mhm,
where investors lose patience and the founders cannot report congruently, right? And so there's a breach of trust there. And I would say just the overall misdirection, right?
mhm,
When we walk into an organization where nobody knows what they're doing and why they're doing it and how my
mhm,
piece connects to the bigger picture,
mhm.
even with AI and all the sophistication, that cannot be masqueraded. And those are typical things that we see as symptoms.
Absolutely. And I think all of those are so critical to have someone like Lindsay or a partner be able to show you that from the outside. It's there's things in life that you are just too close to sometimes that often you can't see a bigger perspective. And again, not something to be shameful of, but something to be honest about in bringing in these types of different resources that helps you see, okay, I know these are the common like red flag roadblocks, whatever you want to call them. But what are the ones in my organization that we need to be able to assess? That's what mature leaders do is they tap their resources for that type of thing. Not to mention, if you are in the process of doing seed funding, having those materials to say, hey, I have assessed this. This is how I'm addressing it within my overall business plan and approach is definitely shows your maturity much more attractive to investors. So now that we covered that, Lindsay, let's go to this audience question from Avery, which is excellent. If you built a checklist for scaling readiness, which you probably already have, knowing you, what are the top three boxes you would want every company to check off? Maybe it's top three, maybe it's top five, maybe it's just one. Just let us know what you always want to see as far as understanding readiness for scaling.
I would say I'm not a huge fan of checklists. I need to start there. Especially in this kind of complicated problems where you need a little bit of more nuance
Mhm,
to assess things. I would say the three main areas where I would look for readiness would be um, what's happening with the capital allocation within the company, right? Where is it
mhm,
misaligned? Where are we spending money, the money that the company brings in as investment or as revenue, right, technically should be aligned with the priorities of the company, not aligned with how many problems we have to solve with this money. So I would always try to understand, right, where is the leak of capital that is typically solving a symptom as opposed to the root of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that I would also look into has to do with the level of improvisation that teams have
Mm-hmm.
in the day to day, right? There is, I work for an organization, and I should say this, I don't have, all my work prior to Human as Usual was me leading the executions internally, right? So I never came in as an outsider consultant or implementer, like as always the person in charge of leading all these things to completion. And so I did have like huge insider view into the hidden conversations that don't go in the conference room. But when you see teams improvising too much, like I saw in this company, where everything is duct taped, everybody's is the hero of their own little silo. Everybody's is super proud of being able to figure out the next hack.
Mm-hmm.
Right, when that becomes the rule and the norm, right, that is a problem, because then you cannot really have healthy systems that can be used for predictability and for standardization where it's
Mm-hmm.
needed. So there's got to be an intentional mix of how do we continue to keep this entrepreneurial spirit so people don't lose their desire to innovate and be creative, but how do we also have systems that work to the extent that is possible, so that people are not spending all the energy and all the creativity and fixing little problems, right, that are just a waste of time. And then the
Mm-hmm.
third thing, there's a question I think coming up about, do we always have to be scaling? Is that always the goal?
Oh yeah, let's go to
And
that.
my experience is that maybe not,
Yes.
right? There is I mean, that is, to your point, Kyler, earlier, that is very unique to the moment of transition of the company, the goals, and where they are in terms of being able to sustain
Mm-hmm.
that scaling,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I entered an organization at some point where they were family owned, and they had grown
Mm-hmm.
for 15 years, and they
Mm-hmm.
had all these
Yep. Yep.
things, and they were so proud.
Mm-hmm.
And they have grown so much that they
Mm-hmm.
were breaking. And so
Yeah.
by the time I joined, their decline was unstoppable, and
Mm-hmm.
they didn't catch it until the financials actually began
Mm-hmm.
to not being able to recover,
Mm-hmm.
right, on quarter by quarter.
Absolutely.
um
Yeah.
and so yeah, maybe growth is not the winning strategy we want to see on the dashboards. Maybe it's more, what does that growth, what does that scale means for the point in time in which
Mm-hmm.
the company is dealing with also internal implosion,
Yeah.
if it is.
Absolutely. Yes. Most definitely. I mean, family owned businesses, generational owned businesses are one of the most complex when it comes to the human side. Because not only are they family, but the leadership is spread out, right? We have generation one that might be 1 to 2 people. We have generation three that are 15, right? So
Mhm.
it's definitely a different dynamic in that type of thing. But I mean, even on the technology side, being everything to everyone spreads you much more thin than being small and specialized and remembering what you do. And we see that a lot right now where we have industries saying, "Oh, okay, I'm a technology company." It's like, "No, you're an automotive company." It's okay to have technology and, softwares, vehicles all over the place, but you have to remember your core values in order to be true to staying successful. And that's
Mhm.
where we start to see that strategy fatigue of the internal team that you mentioned. What are we doing? This looping of who are we? Yesterday we were an automotive company. Today we're a technology company, and we're all focused on AI. And I have zero idea what that actually means for me, my job, and my team. And that's where we start to fill in these types of stories. And the rumor mill starts pumping of, AI is going to take my job. And that's on the executives, right? To be able to understand how to communicate with your entire company. I think that is a huge piece of being able to scale and grow. And I think we
Mhm.
skip over it. And I, would be interested in your opinion on that, because it is so simple that we think, oh, we've been able to communicate as a team of 50. Now we're a team of 500, and we can still absolutely communicate the same way we can. And it's like, no, you can't. And you didn't think through that because you didn't, really dig into the understanding of the fundamental piece of being able to get one message from your board all the way down to your frontline staff. That is way harder than it sounds.
Well, that's why I introduced the measure of integrity
Mhm.
alongside the measure of investment, because that's really what holds that line together, right? I think that, when we operate from a place where, there are companies, most of the companies, I would say, are worth fighting for. I just
Mhm.
think that sometimes um, we get stuck in the individual roadblocks of, how much transparency is too transparent, instead of using transparency, using
Mhm.
communication, using relationship to build bridges, right,
Mhm.
across layers.
Mhm.
um when the layers break, when the connection across layers breaks somewhere, it breaks
Mhm.
everywhere.
Yeah.
and
So
um and that is so important, yeah.
absolutely. That's so well said. So talk to us a little bit in the, we've got about 15 minutes left here. I want to be able to get to the comments we have. But I
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit about how you know when you're approaching the chasm. Like how do we know that we're getting there and we need to be aware of all of the, possibilities, those red flags that you raised, are coming for us.
Yeah. So obviously there's a visual that I always use to explain this. So I'll
Mhm.
do my best to do it with only words. Then the way in which I present this idea is more preventative than it is we already there, right? However, the way it always is recognized is once you already skipped it. And so I would say that the chasm is expected every time you are closing a previous chapter of your company and need to open a new one,
Mhm.
right? So in the world of startups, for example, that we have a very prescriptive model where you have
Mhm.
early stage and seed stage and series A, B, C, D, right? Every time you're crossing those lines and you're getting new funding for improving your company, for growing your company, for increasing your capabilities, whatever it is that you're using that capital for, that becomes a maturity chasm,
Mhm.
right? So there's a I would say an inception one, which is for the companies that are running through this for the first time. And then there are the ones that are caught up with once you get stuck in those regression loops we've been talked about.
Mhm.
Typically, you got stuck in that sort of pedaling because you skip that specific inflection point of being able to rethink how are we going to approach the next growth stage.
Mhm.
Um, so we talked about the some of the red flags. I would say it applies here the same, right? You
Mhm.
would start to
Absolutely.
see um, you know, structure that doesn't really conduce it's conducive of how the company is actually implementing their different
Mhm.
initiatives. We can see really trust erosion, like when we see the example of the misaligned, human scale, where you have funders and founders kind of in a conflict of points of view and interest and expectations, which transpires to the teams. When we see maybe most of the loyal people starting to quietly burn out, and there's like a lot of rumors about leaving or quitting or whatever those toxic dynamics might be. um I would say, in the world of AI right now, which we're all learning as we go,
Mhm.
I would say yes, they are. AI is intending to accelerate things and to make things simpler, but we need to consider that the technology itself is not ready mainstream,
Mm-hmm.
right? So even companies bringing in this technology to make their operations simpler and better, they're bringing in a technology that is in itself immature.
Mm-hmm.
And so that lack of foresight and thinking that I'm just going to bring the sophistication because it's the new thing without thinking of, okay, this is going to be plugged into my environment, is a big red flag for me. And it could
Mm-hmm.
be AI, it could be an ERP, it could be whatever, right, tool
Yeah.
that we're discussing. But there's got to be a level of, we have to eliminate the shiny object syndrome
Mm-hmm.
and bring in tools that we understand and that we know what we need to prepare for. And when there's not, when that doesn't exist and it's just the facade of the Kool-Aid,
Mm-hmm.
I take that as a red flag as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just brought up this question real quick. And if you're listening on our audio format, the question is, how do you see the scaling maturity chasm as shifting in the world when it comes to AI and the pace of growth? And I think that's, something that causes a lot of confusion. And I
Yeah.
would almost, say that the technology can be there. It's more of the maturity of the organization that requires the shifting. So we might have the technical capacity when we're dealing with that, but do we have the data maturity? Do we have
Yeah.
the leadership understanding? Do we have the workforce enablement? And that's why, a lot of our methodology here at the Confluential is looking at AI pilots so that we understand when we're scaling what that looks like throughout the organization, because just like your model, it's a huge change, but we cannot just drop that change on the entire organization because it's not something that we're using in our day-to-day lives. So it's a huge transition in that, so lowering that risk, lowering the stakes of failure or being able to fail forward. I mean, we just saw a bunch of new data drop last week about 90% of AI pilots fail, which is a made up number, right? Like that's not correct whatsoever. But
Well, even the research is immature, right? We're
yes,
all like kind of building the
exactly.
story in real time.
Exactly. Right. So you might your data set in that study, might have been 10 different AI projects. And
Yeah.
what type of AI projects? Was that, a Gen AI project? Was that quality assurance? Like there's just so many levels to that. But I think the overall message there is we're lacking the maturity as organizations, even for our larger, more complex organizations, because we've never had to fuel our technology via the organizational data structure that we do for AI. And that is a huge internal operations, and it's not shiny, it's not sexy, and it's certainly not fun to redo all of your different data. And that's a big piece of that conversation. And I wonder, Lindsay, how you would answer this question, and kind of dovetailing off of that is, how can leaders create culture that don't just scale revenue but also scale people? That is a
Yeah.
deep, deep question.
It is. It is, but it is the foundational question
Mhm.
to everything,
Mhm.
right? We need companies right now that, the way I think about this, I'm gonna include this question in your previous, comment
Mhm.
in my answer, because it's part of the maturity of all this, right? It's not only what's happening inside the organization, but it's the entire is the entire ecosystem of the world that these organizations plug into.
Mhm.
And so it's not only strategizing for the technology, the people, the process, is also thinking of an organization that can last another 10 years, right?
Mhm.
And those are difficult decisions to make,
Mhm.
but it's necessary to understand that even, especially where we are today, where AI is marketed as a silver bullet solution,
Mhm.
AI readiness is this thing that the proxy for future proofing. But the reality is that AI will accelerate the dysfunction of the human systems that are not
Oh
ready,
man. Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And so, if we think about that combined with the pressure leaders have to adopt all these tools faster, then people can absorb the saturation of changes. If we think about the overwhelming experience that teams are having, not because there's a new tech layer, but because there's a lot on the line,
Mhm. Absolutely.
right? In a typical technology implementation, people are already worried about their jobs, let alone
Mhm.
right, with the pressure that we're living in the world to grow at all cost, and the economic volatility that these companies are now having to grow
Mhm.
in, right?
Mhm.
So I think that the biggest thing to scale people, and when I say people, I'm going to include leaders in that
Mhm.
category of people, is realizing that we are all navigating on uncharted territory, that leaders are now learners as well as
Mhm.
their people, right? In trying to not trying to level set the ground for just a ton of conversations and a
Yeah.
ton of uh um I don't want to say upskilling, because that's a word we can talk about in a whole podcast from my perspective. But we need to really level set the environment of the organization for people to digest the
Mhm.
the, the amount of layers that are embedded in scaling in this moment in time and for
Mhm.
the next 10 years.
Mhm.
um that to me is the foundational piece of scaling people, being able to humanize, right, how we see
Mhm.
this transition. Obviously giving people the tools, the resources, the enablement, like you said, is a practical thing to do always.
Mhm.
But at this point in time, what we need is a reconciliation, being able to reconcile continuously,
Mhm.
right? How is it that we're navigating just unprecedented, dimensions of changing things that are all happening at the same time, with
Mhm.
no foresight as to where it could end.
No problem. We can do that. Yeah,
we, but we
absolutely.
need but we need the muscle of discernment, and we need the muscle of being able to have those conversations,
Mhm.
even if we don't have all the answers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you're saying about, it really goes back to our processes, our people, and the discipline of how we run our business. There can be that is how you're agile, right? Is being able to have that maturity to shift as a unit, right? As opposed to everyone running in different directions because there's now something new in the marketplace. I wonder what you would say to these, you know this group of understanding that leaders don't understand their people, and when does that happen, or how do you kind of close the executive bubble? A lot of times we see obviously, you found me via LinkedIn and TikTok. I do a lot of silly role plays about
Yeah.
the executives that don't understand, but the reason those are so popular is because that is real life for many different companies. And a lot of times scaling the people needs to have less of a bubble of what executives think the organization is capable of, but it might not be.
Yeah, it might not be. And the way I would respond to that is the way I handle it when i
Mhm.
when i have to navigate those complexities and those conflicts, is we have to understand the leadership level in layers. There
Mhm.
is the inner conflict of the leader, right? Which could be just a leader that got to be a leader by doing, not
Mhm.
necessarily. And most managers, especially,
Mhm.
they get just put in those positions of management with no training, and then they learn on the job.
Mhm.
Um, th- that happens to a lot of leaders too in senior positions.
Mhm.
And if we have a leader that is conscientious enough, that internal reckoning would move them in the right direction to build that
Mm-hmm.
that discipline and that foresight to understand their people and to put their people first. If the leader does not have that capacity, that's another
Mm-hmm.
problem. But then there's that individual level. Then there is the level of how do we operate as a leadership team,
Mm-hmm.
which to me is the bigger problem when it comes to these type of initiatives, right? Where there's got to be a level of compromise across leadership lines to do what's best for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And when that is not there, that is the work of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
That is my intervention, right? To help find where there is common ground, which typically is not there because somebody's agenda didn't match somebody else's agenda, and now we are in this conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
But opening up those tables to be able to put everything there and be able to say where is the compromise is extremely, extremely important to move forward.
Yeah.
Because to me, when that is not possible, that is what builds the silos at the team level as
Mm-hmm.
well. Now we become rivals inside the same organization that we're a part of, that we're supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
pushing forward. And so that is I would say those two pieces, and recognizing that not a lot of leaders receive the actual maturity process to be leaders. Some of
Mm-hmm.
them know it intuitively, some of them were
Mm-hmm.
just put in those positions without training, and some of them have the privilege, the advantage of being able to learn it. But we're going to find all of that in the mix.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that empathy for leadership is often, especially for the project managers, the program managers that apparently are supposed to know everything and every answer. That's not how that works, right? They're just another human being like you that are trying to do the best that they can. So reframing that resentment of this is being forced upon me and being more curious about why is this happening and what is my colleague
Yeah.
experiencing. I mean, that's the magic a lot of times of what I see in technology or process workshops, is that aha moment where you look across the table at someone in a completely different department and understand, oh, that's why you constantly ask me for X, Y, and Z, because that's what your experience is. And that's really, the biggest piece of that human system is that empathy and understanding of one another. So
Can I
I,
add one more thing
oh,
to
of
what you
course.
just said? Yeah,
Yes.
you just this is just I think it's important to recognize as well. Change in itself, whether it's AI or a new leader or whatever that is, that shakes the ground of an organization, is always an equalizer,
Mm-hmm.
because of the fear element of change. That's natural to human beings,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there is a mismatch of expectations sometimes between, and I know I outgrew this in my own career, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
used to think, well, if this person is a VP, they
Mm-hmm.
should know more than I do. They
Exactly.
should know better.
Exactly.
And in reality, the equalizing fear element of change disregards titles, years of service, years of experience, and it only provides the room for the people and the person that's most resilient at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a life experience, which is not something that
Absolutely.
you just grow, automatically. There are people who have gone through huge amounts of change in their lives, and they've developed that natural resiliency. So when another change
Absolutely.
comes, they can bounce back faster. And there are people who don't have that capacity, no matter how high the title is. And
Absolutely.
so that's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah, I think that one of the best pieces of advice came from an executive I hated. I hated his guts at a Fortune 500 company I worked with. And he said, really getting promoted is all about timing and luck. And you know what? He's not wrong, right? A lot of people were put in those roles because they were able to be a rock star individual contributor, which arguably is the hardest to turn into manager because you're not in control, right? You're not the doer anymore. You're the enabler, you're the coordinator, you're the collaborator. And then a lot of other people, there just wasn't another option. And someone needed to fill that role. And that's, something that you just have to be able to understand. Also, I always talk to people about that idea of radical acceptance of sometimes you're going to have a bad leader, and that is on you, right? Do you want to stay there and work for that person, or are you going to take your life in your own hands and say, I'm going to do something different? But I know we could talk about this all day. I
Yeah.
want to be respectful of your time. We so appreciate you coming on here. So if people want to learn more about your company or connect with you, how can they do that?
I would say two easy ways. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am very active, although the algorithm doesn't love me per se,
It
but I
doesn't
try.
everyone.
I
Yeah.
try to keep fitting my feed with this type of insights and things, and I love engaging and having conversations offline on the platform. And you will find my email, my website, everything is it's there. I try to keep it neat and clean. And I also host two or three private sessions per month by invitation. There's some people that may benefit from board level type conversations
Hmm.
where we can go deeper into diagnostics. Some
Hmm.
people ask about the checklist and what do you measure and whatnot. So what I love to do is invite people that have those challenges and
Hmm.
close doors, really take a closer look at what is the situation and benchmark it with some of the things that I consider important, and just give them some insights that they can take away and implement if they want to.
That sounds excellent. Well, thank you again for your time. I definitely recommend checking out Lindsay's content. You can find all of her information and the company link in the description below, wherever you're getting the episode today. Definitely give her a follow, and reach out. That's how we met, by having a conversation on LinkedIn, and found we are very like-minded in the work that we do.
Mhm.
So definitely always a great connection to have, to understand from that level of understanding the fundamentals. How do we create a company that is scalable and is going to be mature and successful? So thank you so much, Lindsay, for your time. Thank you to the audience for these amazing questions. I will tag Lindsay in them so that we can go through and have that conversation. Absolutely phenomenal. And then we will see you next week for a special episode of ByteSized Live, that I will give you some more information about. But it's my birthday week, so we're having a big celebration around that, for ByteSize. But yes, thank you again to everyone. Thank